A full plate of interesting and in many cases tragic, important issues. Next on the Academics. Hello, I'm Lee Dunstan. Welcome to the Academics. Allow me to introduce our panel this morning. Dr. Nancy Love of App State's Department of Government and Justice Studies, Dr. Michael Wade of the History Department, and Dr. Paul Gates of our Communication Department. Panel, I guess we're all upset and we're all close to outraged, but we're also all numb. The question I have is, the United States seems to stand out among the developed countries as the place most likely to be where one can be gunned down violently. And so the question is there a correlation between this very compelling statistical evidence that it is 10 to 20 times more likely that you will be gunned down in the United States among developed countries? And what are our politicians thinking in relationship to this?
Well, I think clearly the politicians are enthralled to the gun lobby, and not just the lobby, but the manufacturers as well, who provide the money, as do the lobbyists that grease that whole thing. But sure, it's our constant recitation of the Second Amendment as justification for no reasonable regulations whatsoever. I think the freedom thing is really overblown. You look at the rest of the developed world; they're pretty free. Switzerland, Germany, and so forth, and they have highly restrictive laws and a very low, like you say, Lee, a very low murder rate.
Nancy?
Well, we are a developed nation, but we are unevenly developed. And I think it's important to look at the context where this occurred. Umpqua Community College in Oregon, the average age of their students is 37. A lot of them are there to retool. They're studying auto mechanics, nursing, winemaking. There's 8.1% unemployment in the county, and 20% of the people live below the poverty line. So we don't know enough yet about what specifically motivated this shooter. We know he was from the area, and we know that there's a lot of anger and fear that is fueling hate and violence in our country right now.
My question, though, is there a correlation between the way in which we have essentially unregulated firearm possession capability in our country and this dramatic difference in the way in which gun homicides occur in our country in comparison to the rest of the developed world? There seems to be a correlation, and there doesn't seem to be anybody willing to do anything about it. Mike?
Honestly, I don't think there is any easy answer. As you said that, I find myself wondering, why is it that there seem to be so many people in this country capable of that sort of deadly mass violence and not elsewhere? I'm not defending guns when I say that I don't think it can be explained simply by the prevalence of guns, which is admittedly a real problem. Where are all these crazies coming from?
Well, I'm not sure we have a higher crazy rate than anybody else. I don't think that really has anything to do with it. It's just that what crazies there are have easy access now because we refuse to regulate in a reasonable fashion. Not just crazy, but people who have other kinds of motives, racist motives and things like that. Whatever your motivation, you can exercise that pretty easily, walking in for gun shops with minimal background checks, and walk out with the weapon you're going to use the next week.
I'm all for background checks, but I think if not guns, there are other weapons available. Knives, bombs, biotoxins. I think we wouldn't solve this problem by addressing the weapon, right? It's the perpetrators and the causes of their violent acts. And again, we don't know a whole lot yet about this particular incident,
yeah.
but we have had other incidents where it was clear, for example, in the Charleston church shootings, that someone was trying to start a race war.
I don't know, Nancy, about
Let me ask you a question about that. Knives, hammers, ice picks. Wait a minute. That is dramatically different than an automatic weapon. And the kind of mayhem and destruction and carnage that can occur with an automatic weapon in the hands of a person determined to kill is dramatically different than when somebody has a knife or a hammer or an ice pick.
But not dramatically different than a bomb or sarin gas.
No,
Well,
but much more difficult to get a bomb or sarin gas than it is to go out and get an automatic weapon. Much more difficult.
It's not more difficult to get a bomb.
The kind of
it's not.
perpetrators, the kind of perpetrators we're seeing in these examples are not the kind that go around building bombs. They're just the crazies that we talk about who just lay their hands on an automatic weapon with a nice 30 round clip, and off they go. I think the knives and ice picks and stuff, good way to dispatch one or two people.
I think
but that's
the
all
way
you're going to
this
get.
conversation has gone so far demonstrates to me, because I thought it was going to be so simple for me to kind of lay out this rather simplistic idea of the correlation between the dramatic high incidence in the United States of gun killings and how we compare with our fellow developed nations, and have everybody agree, well, there's going to be a correlation. To me, it's absolutely clear that there is some kind of correlation between a lack of gun control or lack of reasonable gun regulation, pardon me, you Second Amendment wild people out there, reasonable gun regulation. And so I don't get it, but now I'm beginning to get it, because my fellow panelists are not necessarily buying into the correlation idea, right, Mike?
No, I find myself wondering if part of it isn't, maybe we'll do better when we can get as upset about 5 people, including a 7-year-old, being killed in Charlotte over one weekend as we do about one of these headline-raising incidents. There's our outrage is episodic. It's determined by media coverage, and I think there's probably also a racial element to it as well.
I think that's a really good point, Mike. And I think if we put it in a larger, or frame the question a little differently, not what makes it happen, but I think we could look at profitably, how do we put up with it? Why do we put up with it and the rest of the civilized world does not?
What's your answer? What's your conjecture about why we put up with it?
I would have to go back to the gun lobby and the argument that this protects our freedoms and so forth, and which I don't buy. But what does it take? I think the next part of that point is, what would have to happen before people would change these attitudes? I mean, for me, it was the slaughter of 20 first graders at Sandy Hook. After that, I'm done. And what have we gained from this? I mean, what benefits as a nation or as individuals do we gain from the free availability of weapons that would justify or make us not uncomfortable with slaughter?
Let me ask us to be specific. What is it that we think is consistent with the Second Amendment, making sure that the Second Amendment is not violated, that people have the right to have and carry firearms? What is consistent with that is also consistent with reasonable regulation that ought to be and is currently supported by a supermajority of Americans? One thing is background checks. right? Another thing is a closer look at the ability, or a workshop, so to speak, a legislative workshop on how we're going to handle people that we believe to be unbalanced. That's another way in mental illness issues. Those two things are supported by a supermajority of Americans, upwards of 75%. Why can't we get going on this, Nancy?
Well, back to why do we put up with it, which I think is the question behind your question.
It is.
These are presented as isolated incidents. You said episodic attention, and we're not addressing the structural violence that is motivating these acts. And much of the anger and fear is being mistargeted toward particular groups rather than recognizing that we have some serious economic issues in this country. We have some serious political dysfunctions in this country that need to be addressed before we will be able to live peacefully with one another.
Yeah, and that's the kind of violence that's reflected by the situation that Mike describes.
Well, I can, but that's a, for want of a better word, that's a macro solution.
It is.
I completely agree. But what can we do tonight, assuming we have some rational legislators who will talk to us about what needs to be done and that will listen to their constituency of a supermajority?
Well, I agree with you on gun control legislation. No
Well,
question.
I think you can end it right there. You said rational legislators who are willing to lead. We don't have them. We don't. We have elected the same people over and over and over again.
So what is the answer? Are you throwing up your hands?
I don't think there is any easier answer.
You're throwing up your hands, and you've got your holster at your side.
I would rather not go for solutions that tinker around the edges. Here's the reality: the gun lobby in this country and our political establishment are not going. They're not willing to talk about reasonable gun control because they view it as a foot in the door, which will lead to more control. Unless and until the political establishment in this country can get beyond that, I don't know about throwing up one's hands, but I do believe in being realistic, and I think that's real.
President Obama has called for constituents to know candidates' positions on gun control before voting in 2016. That's something that everyone can do.
Good advice.
Okay. Well, I can't say that we had a happy conclusion to that portion of the program. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin and what he may be up to in Syria. Everybody probably can agree that Syria is a catastrophe, a human catastrophe, a political catastrophe in almost every imaginable way. What is Vladimir Putin doing meddling in Syria? He seems to be propping up Assad. He seems to also be getting ready to bomb and currently bombing the ISIS people. And he may be bombing some of the people that we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to train, the 6 or 7 of those guys.
A couple of things. One is Syria has been traditionally an ally of the Russians, especially the Assad regime. Secondly, we involved ourselves in that. I think President Obama almost fell into neocon thinking when he imagined that the Arab Spring and how it spread to Syria somehow created an opportunity to bring democracy to Syria. It did the same thing in Syria that it did that George Bush did in Iraq when he deposed Saddam Hussein. It created a power vacuum, and civil wars are nasty, confused things where you really can't separate the good guys from the bad guys. Admitting that Assad is clearly not one of the good guys, and into that we dithered, and we probably should have just stayed out of it. And now in comes Putin. The second thing is this, and I'll say it briefly. I'm disturbed by the television coverage that gives us, the Russian planes are bombing regions where the United States has been supporting rebels. But what they don't tell us, and this is not, doesn't change it, but what they don't tell us is that those regions tend to be regions that are very close to the remaining 20% of Syria that Assad has some control of. For example, the coastal province of Latakia, which is the base of Alawite influence. They're basically coastal. They're only 12% of Syria's population. They're not giving complete information. And they're doing a disservice in doing that, because a lot depends on understanding more fully what's going on over there if you're talking about American public opinion.
Paul?
Well, one thing I'm interested in this is, to the degree that Putin is able to establish Russian influence in the region, it's really going to give him some leverage over the Mideast oil situation. And if he wants to call the tune on the world stage, and he seems to be wanting to be a player, I mean, he admitted as much on 60 Minutes last week, that if he wants to call the tune, he just has to put the squeeze on the oil supply to Europe. And he's got a big, heavy hammer to use there. And that's where that's going, I think, is something very important to think about.
Nancy?
I think Putin wants to keep the U.S. off balance, so he's surprising us. And I also think that he knows Assad's days are limited, and he wants to have a foothold in Syria in order to protect Russian interests in the Middle East. And then we're witnessing the larger destabilization of a world order that's been in place since World War II, following the fall of the former Soviet Union.
Now I'm going to do something that I always am. I yell at my television set at home. I always want the moderator to ask, what would you do under these circumstances if you were Barack Obama? Paul?
Well, I would be ashamed of myself to having let it get to this point.
Well, what would you have done before?
Well, I think I would have intervened early.
What does intervention mean in that context?
I would have supplied equipment. I would have supplied military equipment, not just humanitarian aid.
To who?
To the groups that we felt at the time were probably the Allies.
And I would submit that the reason that there was no intervention was we could never figure that out. We could never figure out where the heck the stuff was going,
right,
and where it was going to end up and who it was going to kill. And so this has been a horrible muddle. Getting back a little bit to Mike Wade saying that this whole area has been a horrible muddle and continues to be a horrible muddle. Anyway, Mike, what would you do?
I don't feel very confident about saying much of anything about what I would do, but I suspect that...
And then you're like the rest of the politicians, because every time anybody even approaches that question, they seem to head for the exit.
Yeah, but I'm not running for office.
I know. You're just thinking that it's a really hard question to answer.
I think I probably would have stayed out of it altogether. Certainly wouldn't have drawn any lines for Assad, and made very few public statements, because you can't really figure out the sides in one of those things. And I think one of our basic problems here in the United States is we've now gotten so busy tending to other people's business, and it's come to the detriment of our own interests. How does it happen that we've become so dependent on the Middle East, and ultimately that's energy? Why aren't we focusing I'm not talking about isolationism, I'm talking about priorities. Why aren't we focusing on fixing our own energy and infrastructure in ways that clearly we're going to need to do instead of engaging in adventurism overseas? Which basically redounds to the benefit of arms manufacturers. And,
Okay, so far I've got Paul. The president should have gotten involved sooner and made some hard choices and hoped that he'd be right helping moderates in Syria against Assad. Is that a fair statement, Paul?
I think
okay.
so, Lee.
Mike, I've got you saying should have stayed out from the beginning. After Saddam Hussein had his neck wrung, the whole area blew up.
we can't fix the planet if we can't fix here.
Got it. Nancy, your turn. You've had a lot of time to think about this.
Yes, I have. And I'm going to take it back a step, and I would have suggested...
You're going to be thoughtful?
I would have suggested that Obama and NATO make a much stronger statement when Putin moved into Crimea and Ukraine, and make it clear that this behavior will not be tolerated by the international community.
But here's the problem, isn't it? There are a whole bunch of people, including, I would suggest, some military leaders inside NATO and in the Pentagon in the United States, who are saying, great, let him bomb ISIS. If we can make that deal, we'll do it all day, every day.
But he's not bombing ISIS, as you already said.
Well,
he's bombing in the area of Hom, and he's bombing Free Syrian rebels, and he's bombing with the permission of the Assad regime and with his parliament, and he's now positioning himself as the legitimate actor, as distinct from the U.S. and our allies, who are also conducting airstrikes.
Anything else on this?
Let's see how that plays out. And you should be careful. You may wind up Carly Fiorina's running mate.
No such aspirations.
Let's move on to the Democrats in this political season and the run-up to the presidential election. Is there an identifiable Democrat Party position, or are we just picking and choosing among Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and maybe what we think Joe Biden might believe and do if he got into it?
No, there's no Democratic position. We have Bernie Sanders' position. Hillary's spending all her time fending off attacks over her email. Joe is still thinking about it, I guess. So we're left with Bernie's platform, and he's really got one.
And that may be a good thing. That is that's the Democrats' big chance in this. I think that for the time being, they ought to forget about who the candidate is, and I know they won't, and focus on what Sanders has put out there. That is, it's the best-looking platform I've seen since historically probably the election of 1912.
Interesting, interesting. So great platform that is supported actually by many of his points, supported by a supermajority of Americans, including Republicans. The question is Bernie electable? 74-year-old, a socialist senator from Vermont who caucuses with the Democrats.
I'm not sure that's the question.
That's my question.
Okay. My response is, I think that this is a winning platform. And by the way, one need not necessarily agree with every last bit of it. I have some problems with free college education for everybody, simply because I don't think college is for everybody. But it's a winning platform, I think, and I think you just said why. large numbers of Americans support that approach. It'd be good for the country.
On whether he's electable, he's raised the funds, right? He has 1.3 million donations at this point, and 3/4 of them are less than $20. And that's an incredible accomplishment. But he's not getting the media coverage. And until the media starts covering him and this platform, which is the statement of Democratic Party principles that we have at this point, we can't elect him. He's not going to have the persona on TV.
He's
in the
going to
media.
get media coverage, though, coming up very quickly with the beginning of the debates.
Right.
We hope.
We hope. Yeah, I'm wondering why he hasn't got more media coverage
Right.
today.
Right. He's
What's
got
going
8
on?
minutes.
Well, it's a lot more fun to watch Hillary Clinton's campaign screw it up.
Oh, but it's not. It's not at all more fun.
Well, it's
and
not more fun for you.
It's not even remotely informative.
Well, when has that become the basis for whether or not it gets on the news?
Oh, I don't know. You know, I guess I just imagined that maybe election campaigns ought to be.
It may
about
be the basis
discussing
for this panel,
things
but
that
it ain't the
things that are of
basis for the
interest to the
news.
public.
Well, our emails have gotten as much coverage as their candidacy.
Okay. Okay, we're going to have to wrap it. It was a lot of fun this week. Audience, thank you for joining us on The Academics. We'd like to hear from you. Please contact us with your questions and comments at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Lee Dunstan. Thanks for watching.